Okay, thank you very much. That introductory comment there virtually sums up, I think, the entire events of the afternoon. A very, very, very good set of suggestions. I'm going to have a look at trying to better understand what corruption and what political corruption is, and how it operates. And it's a bit theoretical possibly, and hopefully not unduly boring. Politics at its heart is about the relationship between a governing elite and the governed, and for that relationship to survive and to thrive, an element of trust is required. So that's at the heart of government. And without basic trust, the social contract that binds society and provides the means to which society functions begins to break down, and the perception of corruption corrodes that trust in a pretty fundamental way. It comes in many forms. Today, I think we're concentrating on political corruption, how it invades the political system. This ordinarily refers to the use of public office for private gain. You've all heard of those kind of concepts. This is where public officials, whether elected or unelected, have been entrusted with carrying out a task on behalf of the public and engaged in some kind of a behaviour for private benefit or enhancement of themselves or groups associated with them. The words illegal and corrupt are often used interchangeably, and sometimes the word immoral is thrown in for good measure. But this may not necessarily be the case in all instances. All illegal transactions are not necessarily corrupt, and surprisingly, all instances of corruption or bribery are not necessarily illegal. For instance, we just saw a discussion recently, I'm just throwing it in because it's so current, the abuse of sick leave arrangements, which according to what I heard recently is much more predominant in the public sector than in the private sector. Abuse of sick leave could be said, it's not an illegal action, but it could be said to be a corrupt action. And what about the medics who are delivering sick certs on a fairly casual and easy basis? Conversely, someone in extreme need, perhaps helping themselves to some food to feed their family, are engaging in a corrupt action, or in an illegal action, but not many people would say it was a corrupt activity. So you see, those complex, those ideas are not easily they cut across one another. But in simple terms, we could define corruption as the illicit use of public office for private gain. That rather narrow and precise definition is challenged by people who would consider corruption as actions that are inimical to the public interest, whether such actions are prescribed by law or not. Now, traditionally, public corruption in Ireland is seen as an activity primarily engaged in by politicians and largely involving brown envelopes of one kind or another. We're familiar with that. But I would contend that the evidence of more recent years suggests that political corruption has infected the wider public service in rather more fundamental ways. And remember, and this is very important, personal gain does not always have to be delivered in a monetary form. So a better definition of public corruption is the inappropriate use of power and authority for the purpose of individual or group gain at the public's expense. But first of all, we need to understand that corruption in politics and public administration is not a recent thing at all. It has a long and dishonourable history. In fact, it's an ancient problem and has never been easy to deal with. A gentleman called Cortia, writing 2,500 years ago in his work, the Athathastra, an ancient Indian treatise on statecraft and economic policy, described its insidious nature rather well as follows. Just as fish moving underwater cannot possibly be found as either drinking or not drinking water, so government servants, he said, employed in government work cannot be found out while taking money for themselves. So that was a problem in India 2,500 years ago. So you might say to yourselves, have we made an enormous amount of progress? Historically, corruption in Irish politics is not something new. Let's be quite realistic about that. The local government system created in 1898 and dominated by the old Irish Parliamentary Party, the party which preceded Sinn Féin and the modern parties, and other smaller parties, became notorious for it through extreme clientelism, which is a concept you'll be familiar with at local level. W.T. Cosgrave, in his time in Dublin Corporation, was an outspoken critic of corruption in local government. And extreme clientelism leading to corruption was one of the reasons Cosgrave's government abolished the rural district councils in the 1920s. The United States witnessed the notorious Tammany Hall phenomenon, which infected a huge amount of their system, and right up until recent times, mainly in New York initially, and was strongly associated with Irish and the Democratic Party. Figures like Boss Tweed were more powerful than any 19th century Irish politicians, and he used patronage and clientelism to maintain his power base. For them, clientelism and corruption weren't a replacement for power, they were the basis for power. And corruption in Ireland isn't limited to local government. In the 19th century, I don't know how you would read this, but the common thing was for huge national collections to be taken up all over Ireland and the money given to great leaders like O'Connell and Parnell for their own private and personal use. Taking account of the fact that politicians weren't paid in those days, there was a certain basis for it, but you could imagine it would raise eyebrows if such a system were operating today. And questions could certainly be posed as well about Eamon de Valera's funding of the Irish press at the beginning of our period of statehood, where funds collected years earlier for the Republic were used by him to set up a newspaper, and then that newspaper got vested in the family. Now that would certainly give rise to very significant questions were it to happen now. Now, the danger of dominance and the sense of entitlement it breeds has also been shown in politics the world over. It's one of the factors which causes a problem, a political dominance. We had seen some evidence of it here, people would contend, in 20th century Ireland, in our main dominant party for so long, the Fianna Fáil party. However, the Christian Democrats in Italy also became notorious even more so for its association with corruption. And it was the corruption and damage done to its reputation that ultimately led to its demise. In India, the dominant Congress party was absolutely racked with corruption. And in more recent times, the dominant ANC in South Africa is having all the same similar aspects. So we're not dealing here with something which is specific to one country, specific to one class of people, specific to one group of politicians. It has the evidence of being a universal condition. And then apart from its longevity, the other obvious but important feature of corruption is secretiveness. That's another element which is important. We don't know how much or how pervasive corruption is. We don't know whether it is increasing or decreasing. It is not amenable to statistical analysis. And in that vacuum, public perception, which itself, of course, is a subjective concept, it becomes critically important. In a democracy like ours, which is fundamentally based on the trust of the people, an increase, even in the perception of corruption, can be particularly divisive. Because at its heart, political corruption undermines some of the most basic democratic principles, such as, and this is referring to our chairperson's comments, the right of an individual to be treated with fairness, with respect and with openness by the government. These are all attacked by these concepts of corruption. Political corruption corrodes the essential concept of equality of citizens before government and public institutions, and if unchecked, contributes in no small way to the delegitimization of the democratic and institutional systems that we have. Because of its debilitating effects in alienating the public from democratic politics and government, political corruption is a matter of increasing concern for Western democracies such as our own. If we consider corruption in simple terms as a disease of the body politic, then no political system seems to be immune from its debilitating effect. In 1999, for example, the whole European Commission was forced to resign over charges of fraud, cronyism and mismanagement. There was an onslaught by the European Parliament on the non-elected European Commission, which led to a significant shift in political power away from the non-elected bureaucracy in favour of the elected assembly. And the dangers of political corruption increases as the state becomes involved in more and more aspects of our lives, as its scope and its power extends. The growth of the welfare state and as a consequence the public sector means that more decisions and control of vast amounts of financial resources have been transferred into the hands of the political elite, both elected and unelected. The question arises, have we put in place sufficient controls and oversight mechanisms to ensure that the public money is being well spent and is not being siphoned off and spent for purposes other than which it was provided? And just to be clear, I'm not talking about increasing just rules and regulations. That just creates incentives for both private individuals, politicians and public officials to circumvent the rules. And they can be very adept at that in reality. The administration of the public sectors of modern democracies such as our own is a large-scale and complex business with concomitant increases in opportunities for engaging in political corruption. In this context, the much-vaunted calls for increased transparency are largely inadequate, as the system is well capable of ratcheting up opacity levels to match any transparency rules and regulations. As I mentioned earlier, political corruption is not just about brown envelopes. It encompasses a far wider range of activities than is normally considered to be the case. It includes, among other things, the abuse of power in the form of arbitrary decision-making by state organisations, and personal gain is usually not at the root of that. It is more a pursuit of personal power and influence. As Abraham Lincoln once said, if you want to test a man's character, give him power. That was quite an insightful comment. In fact, if you want to look at a natural breeding ground for corrupt activity, look to organisations of great power and a culture of secrecy. And that is the perfect breeding ground. We have a few of those animals wandering around our jungle as well. What about the social partnership process of recent years? I'm not wishing to be controversial here, just making an observation that strikes me as being real. This started out as a progressive and effective tool to manage and revitalise the Irish economy in the 1980s, and indeed had a lot of credit for the success of our economy. But it evolved into sectoral vested interest groups engaging in a secretive process of negotiations with politicians and public servants on issues not just about pay for themselves or pay for the public sector, but about pay levels for everybody and other wider issues affecting the whole of Irish society. And this was done behind closed doors, effectively sidelining both the legislative and the executive arms of government, and done by an essentially self-selecting cartel of vested interests, albeit wide vested interests. An integral and infamous element of this ultimately democratic process was benchmarking. This saw a wholesale transfer of public funds to the public sector in return for greater productivity. But even at the time, little attempt was made to disguise the fact that the productivity gains were either fictitious or spurious. In fact, there was one website, I believe, at the time, this was about 2007, which said that one way of showing productivity being delivered was if the employees joined a Happy Heart Club. Might have been a happy moment all round, but that particular website was pulled down after about 2 months. The partnership process even went as far as to create what has been referred to, you all know about this, as various funds, which were used for travel and for they've often been referred to as slush funds, where senior civil service politicians travelled around the world. Someone said up to 40 million was invested in those funds as part of the public sector process, with very little objective accountability as to what the travel was about, what the outcomes were, what the value that was delivered. A partnership in its later phase fits into, or could fit into, a definition of corruption, because it ultimately was a fundamental abuse of political power involving the transfer of benefits to one set of people for very dubious reasons. In many ways, it resembles old-style poke-burn politics and patronage. And of course, what has been revealed by the tribunals, as I'm sure you've heard enough about that, is very relevant. The monstrous mistakes made, the rezonings that are left out of coast estates, or the destruction of so much of our urban environment by poor planning. Even the Moriarty Tribunal even called into question the fundamental behaviour of an entire government department of communication. And that matter has yet to be tested out, and may now, because of recent events, be tested out in open court. And that will be of enormous interest, I must say. All of this has made the electorate cynical about politics in general, that the system itself cannot be trusted, and that undermines the social contract that holds a democratic society together. And those are the problems we have to tackle at this stage in our history now. Now, I referred to ancient India already, but another crowd who were very good at that era in history were the ancient Greeks. Over 2,500 years ago, they were obsessed in their early democracy with keeping their officials accountable. It was one of their high priority items for their actions while in office. At the end of each year, public officials had to stand up before the assembly of citizens and provide a public account of their actions while in office. Any citizen could speak out and bring a charge against the official, and if the Board of Auditors, and the direct translation of the base Greek word there is straightener. So, but if the Board of Auditors found there was a basis for an accusation, the official in question was indicted and tried. The Greeks, who knew a thing or two about human nature, were not seeking transparency. They recognized the frailties in human behavior and put in place clear and robust mechanisms for detecting and punishing political corruption. That's the way they viewed it. And I have to say, as I am neither saint nor socialist, and I'm agnostic regarding the perfectibility of human nature, but I'm largely sympathetic to the Greeks in this one. To preserve the integrity of our democracy from political corruption, we have tried tribunals, and they have proven lengthy, expensive. And when you consider the vast amount of money that was transferred from the public to a group of lawyers in the process, you might almost feel they've developed into a form of corruption themselves. Not suggesting that any individual there was acting in a corrupt manner, but the way that system worked. But the public clearly has no appetite for any more of those, and with good reason. The electorate has voted down the present government's proposal to strengthen political oversight through the Oireachtas committees in a recent referendum. And I don't subscribe to the theory that every time you get a vote you don't like in a referendum, you just go back and keep doing it until you get the right one. So what's left? Perhaps we should introduce something along the lines of the European system of investigating magistrates, where you would have an investigating officer with extensive powers to compel witnesses, whose initial proceedings would be held in private, with lawyers present to protect the rights of the people being accused, and obviously the public interest, and whose final sessions will be held in public and a public report issued, with realistic sanctions for corrupt behaviour applying in a timely fashion. We really do need a system which can grab this and do it. Other countries have it. The fact that we haven't is just impossible to virtually understand at this stage. Also, our public service could benefit from payments by results. The question of incentives with fixed-term contracts. A system whereby, for instance, people get paid their full salary whether they perform or not is clearly a questionable system. The same principle could apply to ministers and members of the Oireachtas. thus reducing the dangers of complacency and excessive longevity, which, as we identified earlier, is one of the key problems which creates the breeding ground for corruption. Single-seat constituencies then could help reduce the rampant clientelism in the system, which has for centuries been one of the key problems. I'm not a great fan myself of artificial salary caps, and I can say that now because I'm retired from kind of salaried occupation some time ago, because they often result in poorly performing people sitting in a job for a very, very long time, to the detriment of very often the organisation. But I think what we have to look at as a nation, we have to get beyond our present difficulties. The economic collapse involving so much tragedy and disappointment for so many people may well prove to be a cathartic experience for all of us. It may and it does give us the opportunity for a new beginning. As a people infused and informed by older and more enduring values than were evident during our wild days of the Celtic Tiger. It may be more about community and society and less about personal aggrandizement and greed. It may be more about personal responsibility and less about dependency. It may be more about individuals, families and communities and less about ruling elites and cartels. It may recognise that Ireland's recovery is everybody's business and that we are ready, willing and courageous enough to embrace that challenge. It may also be that we will be realistic enough and wise enough and generous enough to welcome and accept the help of all of our citizens and friends in bringing this recovery about. As a previous generation had to absorb and deal with the scars of a civil war, our challenge now is to absorb and deal with the scars of an economic disaster, which is of similar characteristics and proportion. There's a couple of important national anniversary celebrations coming down the track. 1916 will be celebrated by Government of the People of Ireland, and rightly so. But there's another anniversary, and a rather important one, in less than 10 years' time. The centenary of the foundation of the Irish state will be upon us. Now, wouldn't it be a fantastic celebratory gift from this political generation to the next to have put in place by then a world-class system for dealing with political corruption? And if we're going to do it, now is the time to start, because, as I've said, in a number of ways, like other evils that beset our democracy, political corruption will not go away on its own accord. It's going to have to be managed away. Thank you very much. Oops.